Hello everyone. So today we are in our second edition of Third Eye. So we have with us Mr. Srinivas Nayak. So today we'll discuss our topic about sustainability. So Mr. Nayak, the first question, if you can reflect, if you can explain the Paris Climate Agreement in brief, what is it actually?
Yeah. So, see, Paris Climate Agreement has been was agreement which was done in COP21, which was in Paris in 2015, right? So, and it actually came into effect in 2016. So, 2015 where the agreement happened, in 2016 it came into action. This in fact followed multiple COPs. COPs is nothing but conference of parties, right? So, which is guided by the UNFCCC, that is, which is United Nations Convention for Climate Change. So it's guided by that. So and the COPs have been done every year. Every year they've been doing. It started from Brazil, and then it is the 2015 where the Paris Climate Agreement actually happened in COP21. There was a precursor to this as well. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was something which was actually kick-started this kind of momentum in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and Paris Climate Agreement was kind of a conclusion to that, wherein 195 nations came across, right? So 195 nations came across and kind of signed this declaration where they said they wanted to kind of keep the global temperatures below 2 degree temperatures centigrade below the above the pre-industrial temperature,
Right.
Preferably below 1.5 degrees temperature. And apart from that, it is also about agreed to put resilience, right, for adaptation to climate change. Because what happens is climate change is something which is real, and that means there is going to be catastrophic events which are going to happen. So countries needs to be adapted to themselves. So that was also put in place. It talked about climate finance as well, wherein the developed nations basically contributing to the climate finance for the developing nations as well. And then also in terms of building strategies, building targets, so that basically countries can meet those targets. So that was in effect the Paris Climate Agreement.
Right. So, Mr. Srinivas, the next point which we want to discuss is what is the science behind climate change, and what are the action plans to be taken by the countries, like both short term as well as long term?
Yeah, so let me just put in context. Climate change is, how does climate change actually happen? The global warming when we talk about, right? So the sunlight which actually comes to the earth is reflected back into the atmosphere, right? So, and especially in the lighter zones, right? So especially if we talk about lighter, you talk about snow and the ice reflects more compared to the darker regions. So when it reflects back, it gets trapped by certain gases, which we call as greenhouse gases, right? So these gases actually trap them and heat the atmosphere. Some amount of them is good because otherwise the Earth would be a very cold planet. So we need to have some amount of that, but higher amount of that, and which we are not used to, will lead to catastrophic events, right? So which are the gases we're talking about, right? We're talking about carbon dioxide, we talk about methane, we talk about nitrous oxide, and we talk about fluorinated gases actually. These are four major gases which are contributing. Water vapor also comes in, but that's not going to be a major impact. But these are four which is going to be the major contributors. You talk about carbon dioxide is basically contributing 75% of that. Then there is methane, which is close to that, and then nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases. But where does it all come from, right? So we saw that, IPCC, in fact, which is nothing but an intergovernment panel on climate change, kind of did a study on this. And they identified there was this temperature, the global temperature for years together was similar. But after the industrial era, there was a sudden steep rise in the global temperatures, and this was correlated with the carbon dioxide levels and the methane levels which was actually there. So this got correlated with that. So we saw that the carbon dioxide levels, which was like something around 280 ppm, became almost like 420 ppm, right? It is just suddenly going up. Similarly on the methane, which was like something about 780 ppb, that is like parts per billions, not parts per millions, which became 1900 parts per billion. Right, so it is like a tremendous increase which happened after the industrial era, and during the same time you could see the temperature is also rising. So they could come to conclusion these were because of these gases, which actually was caused by the human actions which was there. And what are the major contributors? When we talk about the major contributors where these gases are coming in, we talk about carbon dioxide. It's very clear the fossil fuel which is actually right? So the energy production is a major contributor. 75% is actually contributed by energy production, but within them there are multiple reasons for that. One is the electricity production itself by thermal coal plants, which is actually there, and then you also have the transportation, you have the buildings, which is also contributing to a larger amount of that. So this is closing about 75% of them, which is being contributed here. Apart from this, then you also have the methane emissions, which is actually coming in, which is coming from the agricultural sources, right? So which is also in terms of the livestock grazing, right? So methane, which is the animals are going to use the food, which is going to come out as methane gases. And also you have the waste, which is going to be decomposing and causing methane emissions. And nitrous oxides is because of the land use, right? The fertilizers, which is giving nitrous oxide. And then you have fluorinated gases. There are multiple fluorinated gases. There is SF6, there is SCF and CFC and all these things, which has different global warming potential. Fluorinated gases basically come from refrigerants, right? Refrigerants which we use for refrigerator or AC, things like that. There will be leakage of that, which is going to have the global warming potential. Right? I talk about global warming potential because each one has a different global warming potential, right? Okay. Like carbon dioxide has a certain global warming potential. We take in terms of the number of carbon dioxide versus the others. We talk about methane would have a 20-year cycle, would have about 28 times. A 100-year cycle, so 28, it would be about 84 times, right? But for a 100-year cycle, it's about 28 times. But a nitrous oxide remains stable 20 to 100 years to 289 times, and then fluorinated gases are much higher. But if you see the overall contribution, as I said, it is the carbon dioxide which is actually causing the biggest contributor. Now, what happens as we talked about the targets and things like that? Now we need to do, right? Nations need to do certain contributions to reduce this. That's what actually was identified in the Paris Climate Agreement, that nations have to come out with their NDCs. Right? NDCs is nothing but nationally determined contributions. That each of the nations actually come out with their own contributions, that what they're going to do to kind of actually reduce this, keep the temperature within that limits. Right? So, and also they over a period they also came out with a long-term low greenhouse gas emission targets, right? So that's one of the things which they also came out, which is like basically creating net zero targets as well. So which is like countries came out, we will by this year we're going to be net zero. And these NDCs basically were also kind of given year on year, right? A year you are supposed to publish as a legally binding thing. You are supposed to publish what is exactly your current status on that. So that came in being, and every 5 years you are supposed to kind of scale it up. You're going to increase the amount of, make it more better than the last time when we actually kind of done it. Okay. So this is how it actually is coming. So 2030 is a media goal. Many of the countries are going to put in. 2050 is a net zero, which as per the science-based targets is supposed to be happening. We have to have net zero by 2050. That means basically no more zero emissions, right? So zero emissions, in a sense, there is whatever emissions you do, there is offset by something else. Okay, that is again just to put in context of this. There is a difference between net zero and carbon neutrality. And let me just put this also clear. Many of the companies, the oil companies said we are net carbon neutral, right? Okay. Very easy to do, because then they said they continue to do the emissions and then they offset it by putting something else, right? Plantations, which is monoculture, which is not good enough, somewhere else, right? And offsetting it. Then you continue to do the emissions. But net zero talks very differently. Net zero talks about is basically do the maximum, right? 90-95% has to come from your own emissions, right? You don't emit that in the first place. Okay. And the remaining 5-10% is what you offset. That's where the net zero comes in. And 2050 was a target which is given. But of course, countries have their own way of setting these targets, and that's how it's been doing. Like India is 2070 has net zero target. Right?
So now everybody is talking about this thing, that what after Trump 2.0?
Yeah, so if I talk about the Trump's this thing, this is not the first time Trump has actually pulled out. He had done the first time when he came in as well, but that time there was a 3-year binding cycle, and that so nothing much happened, right? There is a binding where you can actually pull out, right? This time it's 1 year. So this will be effective by next year, right? So the effect will come to next year. Now what effectively happens here is basically, you see, there is, as I talked about, one of the Paris Climate Agreement was giving financial contributions as well. Initially it was talked about $100 billion a year, was what was talked about. But then as we grew up, there are things where we need much higher, right? $100 billion was not at all enough. It was $1 trillion contribution was what was actually tried to put in. COP29, which happened in Baku, Azerbaijan, they finally contributed about $300 billion, which is very, very low. In fact, India, Nigeria kind of opposed this. All the smaller nations walked out of the conference because it was not enough, right? And now you have that basically that we don't even want to do that. I mean, that itself is much lesser, right, in terms of contribution. Now you're saying you're not even able to do that. That's going to have huge repercussions because now the smaller nations don't have that capacity. They don't have the adaptation capability. They don't have the technology to kind of actually adapt for climate change. And also it is basically, it's one Earth, right? It's end of the day, it's one Earth. It's either it is not about just doing it at your place. Whatever you do here is contributing to the other place as well. It is a very short-sighted thought about it will happen. Current generation is fine, but you should always think when you talk about these things, climate change is about the future generations, right? It is going to affect your future generation. You need to think a long term, and that's going to be a really bad situation there if it really happens the next year.
Okay, so coming to the next point, so what happens if we do not agree to this climate change agreement?
Yeah.
So what will be the repercussions for this, for the global communities?
Sure. Already we are seeing that. I mean, you can see. I mean, especially in Bangalore, you can see. I mean, the weather is changing dramatically, right? I mean, Bangalore was supposed to be a very, very nice climate, and now it's suddenly becoming hotter and hotter by the day. You are actually feeling it. But these are being done at a slow pace, right? We still not are able to adapt to a certain effect, right? But there are certain tipping points which is going to be catastrophic, right? You know, what happens is now you see there is ice starting melting. The ice melting at the glaciers and these things is going to give a big impact. Now, water temperature, the ice which is going to melt and come out of the sea is going to really impact the sea levels. It's going to just go up like anything, right? So that is going to increase the sea levels, and basically all these small island nations are going to be submerged if you don't do anything. I mean, that's something you need to be worried about. Then there are basically coral reefs are getting bleached, right? You're seeing that almost maximum amount of coral reefs are getting bleached. Now, coral reefs are the complete ecosystem for the fishes, right? The fishes feed on them, and that's the entire ecosystem built. The marine ecosystem is built on the coral reef. You just imagine the bleaching of the coral reefs can mean catastrophic effects in terms of the food and food cycles which you're talking about. Then we also have the permafrost, right? Permafrost is basically ice which is trapped inside, and you have all the organic matter which is just like that. You just left as it is. And what is going to happen is slowly thawing of this permafrost, and suddenly if the permafrost completely goes off, it can be suddenly happening, right? Tipping point is sudden, right? Something like your tire burst, right? Or you're sitting and you just fall off. You are fine as you go down, but you suddenly fall off. That's the tipping point. And permafrost going off, permafrost has double the amount of carbon dioxide which is there in the atmosphere. That is going to be a catastrophe, right? So it's going to go, and then it's just going to create havoc, and then the temperature is going to be uncontrollable. So if you don't do actions now into these things, I mean, there's going to be a huge repercussion, right? In terms of combating climate change, it's going to be everybody's problem now, right? If this doesn't happen.
Right. So now for our last question for this edition. So what the countries are doing currently?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I told, what are the main reasons for the climate change, right? Biggest contribution we talk about was energy itself. So one of the major contributors is energy, and when you talk about carbon dioxide, it's basically is a carbon cycle, right? So currently carbon, which is actually trapped inside, now we are trying to release it in the air, right? So carbon remains as is, it's not going to go, right? But what we are trying to do effectively is what is in the earth, we are trying to put in the atmosphere, that is what we need to reverse now, all right? What is there in the earth, we'll let it remain there. So that means effectively kind of changing, keeping the balance of carbon dioxide as is the first thing which we need to do. That means basically finding alternatives for energy, right? So if you see where the whole emissions are coming in, where the causes for the global warming, if you see that, the major part is in terms of the energy itself, right? So the fossil fuel based energy. So the first thing is basically reduction in terms of the fossil fuel based energy, removing that energy to a more cleaner and greener energy. So that's the first thing which is actually being done. So removing all the coal based system to the renewable solar and wind energy, and these are the areas where we can work on, right? So that's an area, and in fact before that also it is important to transition to more energy efficient machineries, right? So that's the first part, and then in terms of converting into the greener energy. So electrification is another big thing where basically we go into electrification. So most of the things, if you are able to electrify, then that's the second part of it where we will be able to kind of take a transition. And then in terms of green buildings is one of the areas. Also, it is important that basically the fertilizers what we use is basically having less nitrous oxide, which is actually there. So that's another area where we're going to look in terms of, and also in terms of the using to plant-based food compared to the meat-based food. So that's another way of doing it. And these are some of the areas where kind of work is being done, and when we progress, I mean, it's going to be more economically to do it that way. The transition is going to be great in terms of doing that.
Great. So I think with this we end our session. So I would request the audience to wait for our next edition, where we will dive deep into sustainability and take it forward. So thank you, Mr. Nayak.
Yeah.
So see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.